Hey everyone, this is lesson 524, Intro to the Quadratic Formula. Now, up to this point, we've been solving quadratic equations a few different ways. Early on, we learned to factor in order to solve an equation. And just recently, in this same chapter, we've introduced completing the square. All right, so those are kind of the first two things I want to remind you of. We have been looking at a couple ways to solve equations, quadratic equations. Also, we have seen quadratic equation written in a couple different forms, standard form, factored form, and we've recently looked at perfect square form when we want to use completing the square. So with quadratic formula, we're going to be utilizing the standard form to help us use the formula as our third option to solve quadratic equations. All right, so let's get started. You'll notice in the standard form, I've kind of highlighted or used a different color for the letters A, B, and C. These are going to be key to us solving our equation. So our third approach involves this formula here. So we have x equals 2. You'll notice this is already written in x equals form. This is not y equals, this is x equals, which means this is already our answer. All right, the formula has already been solved for us, or the equation has been solved for us. We just need to plug in all the numbers. And so in this case, we have a negative b. I've put parentheses around these just to kind of as placeholders, but for the most part, I think if you see this formula anywhere else, most likely you won't see it with parentheses. But I think it helps when we solve it. So we have negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c. This is our fraction bar, so that's going to be all over 2 times a. All right, so this is our formula we're going to be using. So as long as we know our ABCs, we could use this formula. So all we need to know is what is A, what is B, what is C, and plug them in. All right, so it's pretty straightforward. Let's look at an example. This is problem 96. I already have this one written out for us. I think this is here. Here's the complete problem. All right, so we're given this equation, x squared minus 3x minus 7 equals to 0. And we're told to solve this. So you would have a couple options. Before this, we would probably try to factor it. If it factors, then that could be an option for us. If it doesn't factor, then we're looking to complete the square. That's always an option as well. In this case, I see a negative or a 3, an odd number. I don't like to do completing the square when we have odd numbers. So quadratic formula is a good fit for us here. And I don't believe this factors nicely either. So what I've done is I've written out our formula. And so usually when I start this, I pretty much write everything except the A, B, and C's. That's the one thing that I leave out. But I put parentheses for everything else. So when I want to figure out what my ABCs are, where I'm looking is at my original equation. So a lot of times you'll see this is A equals 1. You'll notice in this case there is no number or coefficient in front of the x squared. So in that case, that means this is a coefficient of 1. All right, so not 0. Even though we don't see it, a lot of times people think there's a 0 there. It's really a 1 times x squared. And so our b value in this case is negative 3. We want to keep that minus with it so that it remains a negative 3. And this is going to be, the C value is going to be our -7. So as long as you could identify those three numbers, then you should be good to use the formula. So if you don't remember the formula, then I suggest you always have it near you so that you can look it up, write it, I'll even write it out again. So it should be x equals to -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. All right. And so that's the formula we're using. I would suggest writing that out near the problem you're going to be working on so that way you can just always reference it. Once we plug in all the numbers, so I plug in my b values, you'll notice I plug in a -3. This is one reason why I like to keep the parentheses there so that I don't assume. A lot of times people will see that there's already a negative in the formula and they say, oh, if there's already a negative there, so I'm just going to put -3. Which is not correct, right? So it's going to be a -3, which then will end up turning positive, right? So this will end up turning positive. So be careful there. Trust me, putting the parentheses is going to help you tons to avoid making mistakes. Same thing inside the square root. You'll notice there's a -3 squared. So be careful on a calculator. If you put -3 squared in a calculator, it's going to give you 9, which is wrong. I'm sorry, it's going to give you, -3 squared is going to give you -9, which is wrong. So be careful there. If you put parentheses around the -3, then it's going to give you a +9, which is what we want. So be careful there. That's probably the one place where there's a lot of mistakes. People thinking they don't need parentheses here always tend to make the most mistakes. Even just right now, I just made a mistake doing it in my head. So be careful. The steps are not very long here, but there's still opportunity for mistakes, so be cautious. The next step would be to simplify this. I'll zoom in for a second. We're looking at one is I always try to simplify the outside first. So if it's a double negative, then I make sure it's positive. We still have the plus or minus that remains. And the inside, I like to keep the square root and just do each part separately. It reduces errors as well. So -3 squared gives us a +9, like I said. And then I have -4 times 1 times -7. So if you can't do that in your head, sometimes they're easy numbers, sometimes they're not. I would suggest even typing that into a calculator. And I would treat this as though it was a -4. -4 times 1 times -7. So negative times a negative gives us our positive. All right, so 4 times 7 is 28. And then this is 9 plus 28 is 37. You'll notice I still have the square root. And in some cases, this might be it. That might be our final answer. If this was 36, if this was a 36, then we could keep simplifying it some more. So a lot of times people don't like the square roots, numbers like this, because they think it's harder. I actually like them because we get to stop sooner. We don't have to do as much work. So that's kind of the benefits to looking more complicated. We actually get to stop sooner. So here we have our two answers. We have our positive and our negative, or the plus and minus versions of our two answers. That would be our exact. And if we type that into a calculator, we would get these decimal answers as our approximate. So be careful when you do type it into a calculator. If you happen to type it in all in one line, for some of you that might do something like this, you will most likely get a wrong answer. So because it's going to do this part together and the 3 is going to be separate. So you want to make sure you do the top part first, or maybe even put parentheses around it, then put divided by 2. So to make sure the whole top part gets divided by 2. So just a little bit of suggestions on how not to make mistakes. So that's kind of the general idea of it. I think it's pretty straightforward, but it doesn't mean that it's always going to be super easy. So there's always a lot of mistakes here. I'm going to go over, there's 4 problems here on problem 97. And we'll see how these go. They're all a little bit different in their own way. You'll notice they have numbers in front that are not 1, which is why if you saw this, you probably wouldn't necessarily want to factor it, or you probably wouldn't want to do completing the square either. So quadratic formula, yeah, is probably one of our best choices on this type of problem. So, all right, so let's look at doing these. And let me write out the formula here at the top. X equals to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. All right, so make sure that square root covers the whole second part of the numerator. So you don't want to draw it too short. All right, so probably the first thing I would do is think about what my ABCs are. So in this case, A equals to some number, B equals to some number, and C equals to some number. All right, so let's see if you know what those are. All right, so in this case, A equals to 3, B equals to 7, and C equals to 2. All right, so let's set up our formula. So I'm going to do, this is how I like to do this, negative something plus or minus the square root of something squared minus 4 times something all over 2 times something. All right, so this is a good way to start, and all you have to do is plug in your numbers at this point. So make sure you look back at your formula. If you don't have your formula, have it near you and say, okay, first I'm going to put the b's in. So I'm going to put the b's in. That's 7, 7, and then A is 3, and then C is 2, and then A at the bottom is going to be 3. All right, so I'm just plugging in the numbers. So if you've gotten this far, that's pretty good. You've pretty much solved for your x. It's all about simplifying. So if you typed all that into a calculator and you typed it in perfectly, then it's going to give you, it could give you a nice number. It could give me a decimal number. But most of the time when people try to type in the whole thing, they don't know if they made a mistake or not. And if they do, they don't know where they made it. So be cautious. Don't type in too much. Try to simplify as much as you can. So here, let's get started. This is going to be negative 7 plus or minus square root. This is going to be 7 times 7 is 49. And the second part to this, is negative 4 times 3 times 2. I think that's going to give us a negative 24. So I don't need this so long. And then this is going to be divided by 6. All right. So if you're able to get this far, and if you're having issues, like if I saw your work, I could very easily tell if you had a calculation error. So be cautious when skipping steps. It doesn't really help you in the end. So x equals to negative 7 plus or minus. So we want to know what 49 minus 24 is. That comes out nicely to the square root of 25. And so that tells me that's good. So this is going to be negative 7 plus or minus 5 over 6. All right, so we're going to have two possible answers. X equals to negative 7 plus 5 over 6, and x equals to negative 7 minus 5 over 6. Oops, I didn't put a 6 on the bottom. 6. All right, so our remaining answers are going to be x equals to 7 plus 5 is 12. 12 divided by 12 divided by 6 is 2. And then negative 7. Oops, sorry. This is an error. I'm going too fast. Negative 7. It's supposed to be negative 7 plus 5. So that's going to be a negative 2 over 3, which is negative 1/3. All right. And then this one is going to be negative 12 over 6, which is negative 2. All right. So negative 1/3 and negative 2. All right, those are our two answers for that one. So you can see how if the numbers simplify, there's actually a little bit more work to do, which numbers usually work out nicely, which is okay. But sometimes I like it when there's a square root in the answer, so we have less work to do. All right. So I'm going to go over the next one. So there's a total of 4. I'm going to go through all 4 of them because I want you to see the difference on some of these answers. So let's start with our ABCs, A, B, C. And let's see if you know what your ABCs are on this one. So A is going to be 2. B is going to be negative 9. Right? Don't forget that negative in front of the 9. And C is going to be negative 35. All right, so these are definitely big numbers. I wouldn't want to try to solve it any other way besides quadratic formula. So I'm going to set this up. So negative something plus or minus the square root of something squared minus 4 times something times something. All right, keep in mind there's always going to be this 4. This 4 is always part of the formula. So that's always going to be there. All right, that's a common question. People ask, where'd you get the 4 from? That's part of the formula. All right, same thing with the 2 at the bottom as well. So if you remember, there's always going to be the 4 and there's always going to be that 2. All right, so now that we know our ABCs, we set up our formula. We just got to plug in all our values. So let's plug in our B's, negative 9, negative 9. And then we have AC, which is 2 times negative 35, and A on the bottom, which is 2. All right, once you've plugged them all in, then the next thing for us to do is just to simplify it. So one step at a time. Let's do, and don't forget your x equals. Another common mistake is a lot of times people will just focus on the formula and ignore this part. On a test, anytime I see that, I mark it wrong because the whole point was we're trying to solve for x. So this whole thing is part of the formula. Don't forget your x equals on this part. All right, so this is going to be negative times negative is positive 9. And then negative 9 squared So again, if you type in -9 squared like this, let's see if I get it right this time. -9 squared like this, it'll give you -81, which is wrong. We don't want this. We want -9 with parentheses squared, which means this is the same thing as -9 times -9, which equals to +81. All right, so be careful there. Either work it out on paper or in your head properly, type it into the calculator properly. Whatever you're going to do, just make sure you get those numbers correct. So this is going to be 81. And then the second part is going to be, let me use green. So -4 times 2 times -35. So let's see, I'm going to need a calculator for this one. So -4 times 2 is -8. That's for sure, I know. Times a -35. Okay. So that's going to, negative times negative for sure, I know that's going to give us a positive. And then when you multiply all those numbers, it's going to give us 280. All right, I don't need this so long. And 2 times 2 is going to be 4. All right, so now we have 9 plus or minus, what's 81 plus 280? 81 plus 280. All right, 361. Is that right? All right. And so does that work out nicely? Wow, it does. All right, so that looks, I probably would have stopped there if I didn't already know the answer. So 361, is that a perfect square? Surprisingly, it is. All right, so that actually simplifies. If you didn't know that, I didn't know that, so right now. And so that's 9 plus or minus 19. All right, so always take the square root of that number just to see if it's a perfect square. If you get a decimal, then that means it's not. So leave it in radical form if it is. If you get a decimal, just leave it in radical form. All right, there's our two answers. We're going to have a 9 plus 19 over 4 and 9 minus 19 over 4, which, let's see if I could squeeze this in. Let me move these. This is going to be x equals to 9 plus 19 is 28 divided by 4 is 7. That's a nice number. And x equals to 9 minus 19, that's a negative 10 over 4, which is going to be a negative. You could either leave it as a fraction, 10 over 4 reduces to 5 over 2, or you could write it as a decimal, 2.5. All right, so there is another set of answers. All right, so you'll notice how the work looks pretty much the same on both of these. The process should be the same. Hopefully this is getting easier. And all right, I think I'm just going to keep going. I think the more examples you have in your notes, the better. You should see the same pattern of work on this one. All right, I'm just going to try to work it out, and hopefully I get these correct. So this is going to be, I need my ABCs. This is going to be 8, 10, 3. negative something plus or minus something, square root of something squared minus 4 AC. Oops, that looks sloppy. 2 times something. All right, so let's plug those in. So we're going to have 10, 10, 8, and 3, and 8 on the bottom. All right, and then we start to simplify this. This is going to be negative 10 plus or minus the square root of 100. 10 squared is 100. And this is, I notice I only have one negative here, so that means this is going to be a minus 4 times 8 times 3. What does 4 times 8 times 3 give us? Oops. This is going to give us 96. All right. That's a good number because, right, 2 times 8, 16. 100 minus 96, that's going to give us a nice 4. So square root of 4 over 16, which means we have negative 10 plus or minus 2 over 16. All right, and there's, we're going to get two answers, negative 10 plus 2 over 16, and x equals to negative 10 minus 2 over 16. All right, so leaving us with negative 8 over 16, and x equals to negative 12 over 16. All right, so both of those reduce. I'll leave those in reduced form. So x equals to negative 1/2, and x equals to negative 3/4, I believe. So, all right, so there's those. It looks kind of long, but you do these enough times and you'll notice the steps are the same. Some of this could be a lot easier than having to think about doing an area model and factoring and all that stuff. All right, so one last one, and in this one we look for A, B's, and C's. This is going to be a 1. You'll notice there's a 1 in front, right? Invisible 1. Negative 5 and a 9. All right. So on this one's a little bit different because when we start to plug in numbers, you should see that when I plug in these, I think it's about right here. AC1 and was it 9? All right, 2A. 2A, A is 1. All right, so maybe it's not so obvious right there. So when we simplify it, you'll notice we get positive 5 plus or minus the square root of 25, positive 25. That number is always going to be a positive number. And then we're going to have minus 9 times 4 is 36 over 2. So when we start to simplify this, you'll notice what's 25 minus 36? 25 minus 36. Do you know? Do you know? Well, if you do it too fast, you might get the wrong answer. This is a negative 11. Negative 11. Right? So if you have $25, you can't take away $36 because you don't have that much. Right? You're short $11. So when you get to this point, you should notice that we have a negative in the square root. And we've talked about these before. You cannot have a negative in, or you could, but when we solve it and you put that in a calculator, we already know from some of you that remember from previous lesson, you're going to get an error message, or maybe you might say undefined, depending what calculator you use, undefined or error. So what this tells us is we're going to have no real solutions. All right, but we did solve it. All right, we have answers. We have two answers, but we have no real solutions. Right, and that'll make more sense on the next next week when we go over how to deal with those type of answers. All right. So for the most part, this is what you need to be able to do. Hopefully this looks like a better option for you when solving equations. Let me know if you have questions about this, and we'll see you next time.